So, Stefan Molyneux, whose YouTube username is StefBot, has started a series of videos entitled The Salvation of Philosophy. I noticed the ambiguity of this title right away, but I chose to give him the benefit of the doubt, thinking he was referring to the idea that philosophy can be salvific. But upon watching the first video in the series, I found that I was being too generous.
When I was contemplating abandoning my career in order to pursue philosophy full-time, I made a vow to myself that I was only going to make the leap and take the risk if I could genuinely advance the discipline in some significant ways. I was so sick and tired of watching philosophy getting its ass kicked all up and down the beach that I vowed either to bulk it up and teach it to fight or walk away forever.
That's right. Stefan Molyneux thinks he is the salvation of philosophy. That's a pretty ambitious role to cast oneself in, not the least of which because you have to actually show that philosophy is in need of salvation to begin with. So, what exactly is the problem plaguing philosophy, according to Molyneux?
Philosophy continually fails because it does not identify and reject the self-detonating statement, sometimes also boringly called a performative contradiction. A self-detonating statement occurs when the form of a proposition contradicts the content of the proposition.
Okay, before I bust up this party, and god damn am I gonna bust it up, I've got to make a point of clarification. A performative contradiction is not when the content of a statement contradicts the form of the statement. That's closer to what's traditionally called a self-refuting statement. A performative contradiction is when a statement contradicts the presuppositions that make the statement possible in the first place. They're, of course, closely related, but they are not the same. I'm sorry to be so pedantic about this, but honestly, if this guy is going to claim to be the salvation of philosophy, the least he could do is try to grasp the finer points of its technical vocabulary. But pedantry aside, whatever you want to call them, let's take a look at a few examples of these self-detonating statements.
For example, if I yell into your ear that there is no such thing as sound, the fact that I am using sound to communicate that there is no such thing as sound is a self-detonating statement. Last example. The statement, language is meaningless. This is also a self-detonating statement because the form of the statement directly contradicts its content.
These are clear examples of the concept. But what does this have to do with philosophy? I've never heard a philosopher argue that language is meaningless, although I suppose I wouldn't put it past Derrida or some other postmodernist, but there's a reason why he was voted the penultimate worst embarrassment to the profession of philosophy, second only to Ayn Rand. So let's get to the good stuff.
The vast majority of intractable and frankly boring philosophical disagreements occur precisely because people ignore these self-detonating statements. I have used this approach to solve problems in the realms of determinism versus free will, knowledge, ethics, politics, agnosticism, atheism and religion, and many other branches of philosophy. And now, for what I believe is the first time in its long and sorry history, philosophy has finally got some real game, baby.
Have you ever heard of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates?
Yes?
Morons.
The idea that philosophers haven't recognized the existence of such statements is utterly preposterous. Socrates made an art form out of leading people to realize their own self-detonating statements, and it's been a staple of the discipline ever since. The form of argument known as reductio ad absurdum, which employs a similar tactic, dates back at least as far as Euclid. The only thing novel about this strategy at all is his title of self-detonating statements, which is fine enough as far as it goes, but it hardly makes Molyneux the second coming of Ludwig Wittgenstein. St. Thomas Aquinas, René Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, Bertrand Russell are all morons, apparently, in Molyneux's eyes. That really gives you some insight into this man's psyche, to say nothing of his basic appreciation for the history of Western thought. Oh, and Stefan, as far as your complaint that philosophy is boring, maybe you just had boring teachers. Because from the very first philosophy class that I took as an undergrad, my very first day of college, I thought philosophy was the most fascinating subject ever contemplated by the human species, thanks in large part to a very long list of excellent teachers. And not to toot my own horn here, but I have received hundreds of anonymous teaching evaluations, and while they have not all been uniformly stellar, I can honestly say that not a single one of them has ever said the subject was boring. Now, I might abide Molyneux's monstrous ego if it were coupled with comparable insight, wisdom, and perspicacity, but sadly, all those seem to be in fairly short supply too, at least if the second video in Molyneux's series is any indication. In that video, Molyneux targets people who deny
property rights. Why are they so important? Well, without property rights, there's really no such thing as philosophy.
Okay, he's going to make an argument for this claim, but before we get to that, I want to point out how ahistorical such a claim is. Philosophy dates back at least to the 5th century BCE, whereas the concept of property rights does not appear in Western consciousness until the 16th century of the Common Era. Now, that doesn't mean that there were no property rights for those 2 millennia, of course. But it does mean that the people in that time period did not, indeed could not, respect people's property rights in virtue of the fact that such a concept would have been completely alien to them. But nonetheless, during this time, philosophy was not only born, but matured and flourished to the point where eventually the concept of property rights could spring from it.
Property rights rest on 2 central pillars. The first is self-ownership, and the second is responsibility for the effects of one's actions. Self-ownership simply means that I am responsible for my own body, just as a man is responsible for, i.e., owns, the argument he creates in a debate, an effect of self-ownership. A man is responsible for, i.e., owns, crops that he plants, grows, and harvests from a piece of land. My argument does not exist in the world if I do not communicate it, and crops do not exist if you don't plant and harvest them. It is this bringing things into existence that is the essence of property. It is not stealing from someone else, but rather creating something new that establishes property.
Hopefully his basic argument is clear. I own my body, therefore I am responsible for what I do with my body. If I cultivate materials with my body, then those materials become my property, and hence I have a right to them. This is, I think, a pretty good basic sketch of an argument. It's a damn shame Molyneux didn't give credit to the guy who invented it. John Locke, in his second treatise on government, written over 250 years before Molyneux was even born. And I'm pretty sure Molyneux is aware of the argument's pedigree, because he claims on his YouTube page to have written a master's thesis at the University of Toronto on the political philosophy of, among others, John Locke. But even if we overlook that minor piece of plagiarism, there's another problem at hand. Molyneux doesn't consider any of the criticisms of Locke's arguments from the last 320 years of political philosophy. How about this criticism from Robert Nozick?
See, Stefan, that's how you're supposed to do that.
When I mix my labor, which I am responsible for, with the raw materials of the world, why don't I lose my labor rather than gaining the material? Nozick's metaphor is very memorable. When I pour a can of my tomato juice into the ocean, I don't gain an ocean. I lose my tomato juice. Now, Nozick ultimately agrees with something like Locke's argument, but that just sort of illustrates the point. Nozick has the intellectual integrity to consider counter-arguments, whereas Molyneux is simply leading his audience to believe that it's a completely simple issue that he can solve in a 7-minute YouTube clip. Even if we are responsible for some of what our bodies do, it does not follow, therefore, we are responsible for all of what our bodies do. Even if we own ourselves and our labor, it does not follow from that alone that we are therefore entitled to the materials that we mix our labor with. You can't prove such a conclusion simply by analyzing the logical structure of its denial. To even attempt to do so is not only hubristic in the extreme, it betrays a tremendous failure to treat the history of political philosophy since Locke with even a modicum of charity and respect.
If I'm not responsible for the effects of my actions, if I do not own what I do, then there is no such thing as morality, of course. If I am responsible for actions, throwing a ball, and the effects of my actions, breaking a window, then we have established the basis for property rights.
No, we haven't. At best, we've established the basis for property, but there is nothing in that argument that even suggests that the best framework for understanding property is this very specific concept of rights. Nowhere in his video does he even hint at an argument in favor of rights theory. He seems completely oblivious to the idea that we can make sense of self-ownership, personal responsibility, and property in terms other than that of rights, such as, for example, the concept of utility, or the concept of the virtues, or the concept of human relationships, all of which have been used as the basis by many thinkers much smarter than either Molyneux or myself to try to ground these concepts.
Some people will argue that self-ownership is invalid, but this is a classic self-detonating statement. If I want to argue that self-ownership is invalid, I must first exercise self-ownership by making the argument using my body in some manner. Typing, speaking, miming, hand puppets, something.
This argument bears a striking resemblance to a famously ridiculed argument in the philosophy of biology. At the dawn of the 20th century, French philosopher Henri Bergson argued that living organisms possessed an élan vital, or a vital force, the presence of which is what distinguished living things from non-living things. One of the arguments made in favor of the concept of élan vital, not made by Bergson for the record, was this: you must believe in élan vital, because if you did not have élan vital, you could not be alive to argue that there is no élan vital. The denial of élan vital fits perfectly into Molyneux's idea of a self-detonating concept. But nonetheless, the very idea of élan vital is lambasted as preposterous and idiotic today, due in large part to the fact that there isn't a shred of empirical evidence in favor of it beyond the very thing that it was purported to explain: living organisms. The only thing appealing to élan vital did was point to an obvious fact. Some things are alive and some things are not. It does not explain that fact in the slightest. Molyneux is doing the exact same thing here. He's pointing to an undeniable set of facts, that people move, that people make arguments, and sometimes they deny the concept of self-ownership. He assumes, without any argument at all, that the only way to account for these facts is through the concept of self-ownership. This is a classic example of begging the question. Now, for what it's worth, despite what I hope have been some fairly biting criticisms, I don't think Molyneux is completely worthless. He is very well-spoken. His experience in radio is abundantly clear. He can edit a video rather nicely, and some of his arguments are even halfway decent. But this should not distract us from the litany of major flaws I've tried to draw your attention to. The straw-manning of his opposition, begging the question in his favor, the overestimation of the power and scope of his basic methodology, the failure to credit thinkers from whom he explicitly borrows, his stunning failure to appreciate the history of the very discipline he proclaims to be the savior of, and perhaps worst of all, his grotesque sense of self-importance. One of the most important lines in the history of philosophy is Socrates' claim that wisest is he who knows he knows nothing. It would seem that Molyneux has not learned this lesson and has simply written it off as yet another self-detonating statement. But as any intro to philosophy student can tell you, Socrates did not intend, in making such a claim, to be taken literally. He's trying to remind us all to be intellectually humble in the face of the grandeur and complexity of the world and the myriad philosophical problems it contains. We may believe, as Molyneux appears to believe, that we have all the answers. But millions, if not billions, of people before us have thought the same thing, and the vast majority, if not the entirety of them, have been wrong in their own estimation of their knowledge. If Molyneux's ears are deaf to nearly all the critiques I've leveled at him, I hope I can drive home those wise words of Socrates in a more abrasive vernacular. Stefan, get off your fucking high horse.